When our present wilderness experience began 3 months ago, brought on by the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the first responses of many people was that of fear. And as is human nature, many people reacted by turning inward and also taking actions that would make them feel safe. We saw that in terms of panic buying, of hoarding, of collecting of personal protective equipment or PPEs. But then the messaging changed and we were asked to think of other people besides ourselves, other people like medical personnel and first responders, to make sure that those who were on the front lines were kept safe. Regular citizens were then asked to shelter in place, to wash our hands, to maintain social distancing, and to wear masks. Not so much to protect us, because the mask would not protect us unless it was a N95 or something like that, but to make sure that we did not unknowingly transfer a virus that we might be carrying to somebody who might be vulnerable. In our sermons over these last 3 months, we've been following somewhat of a similar progression. At first, our natural response was to look to Scripture for comfort, to ask, how does God work in our wilderness experiences? And that was good, and that was right. But with a second pandemic arising of violent racism in our country, compounding people's suffering on top of the virus, it became clear that, at least for a time, it is crucial for us to focus on others who are being impacted, who are hurting, and to ask how God would want to use us to help others in their wilderness experiences. As we mentioned last week, wildernesses like the one we're presently going through often leave us feeling overwhelmed, even helpless, wondering if there's anything that we can do to make a difference. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't leave us in a hopeless situation. Last week, Ezekiel showed us that we can begin by listening to God as well as listening to other people who are hurting. We can begin by, after listening, genuinely lamenting those things that grieve God's heart. Even perhaps sitting in silence as long as is necessary so that we can come to a place where we really understand things from God's perspective. And then finally, looking to God to guide us. Listening, lamenting, and looking to God. Those are some things we can do. This week, Jesus' parable of the Good Samaritan presents us with the good news that we really can do something if we are willing to challenge our own aversion to get involved. In Luke chapter 10, verses 25 to 37, we're told that an expert in the law wanted to test Jesus. He brought up the two primary commandments for God's people: to love the Lord with all one's heart, soul, strength, and mind, and to love one's neighbor as oneself. The interesting thing is that these were the two very commands that Jesus himself had said encompassed all of the gospel, all of the commandments. For if you truly kept these two commandments, you would not be guilty of breaking any of the other commandments. Today we would say, it says this: love God and love people. But as with so many people, this expert in the law could not conceive that God meant for him to love all people. I can't love all people. So he goes on to ask Jesus, well, who is my neighbor? Who does that mean? It probably doesn't mean everybody. Probably he's thinking that it refers to people who looked or talked or acted or thought like he did. But in Jesus' answer, he rocks this man's and our world. He talks about a crisis situation where a man who was headed to Jerusalem was robbed, beaten, and left for dead on the side of the road. Jesus then speaks of three people, two of whom the legal expert would probably have thought, oh yeah, that's my neighbor. After all, they're people really pretty much like me. And the third person was someone that he probably definitely would not have considered a neighbor. Now, he's not one of us. The first person to come onto this upon this poor man was a priest, somebody you'd expect to do right and to do the right thing and help him. But he does what a lot of people do. He does not want to get involved, so he crossed over to the other side of the road and continued on his journey. The second person was a Levite who assisted the priests in the temple. It's kind of like a religious lay leader, a Christian leader. Again, people would have expected him to help. But he too does not want to get involved, so he crosses over to the other side of the road and continues on his way. Finally, the least likely person, a person on whom everyone in Jewish society looked down, considered inferior, suspect, of mixed race, he comes along. And he does what most people would not have expected him to do. He saw the man, and he knew that the man was part of a group of people who had despised his kind. But he had compassion on him. He went to him. He got down on his knees and gave him first aid, not worrying about getting the man's blood on his clothing. He put him on his donkey and he took him to a hotel where he cared for him. And then when he had to go on, he paid several days' wages in advance and said, listen, if there's anything more, just put it on my bill and I'll pay it when I come back through. That person, we're told, was the one who was the true neighbor. And Jesus exhorted the legal expert as well as all of us to go and do likewise. Recently, I heard a pastor named Jason Kane. He's a black pastor in a predominantly white Bayside church in Elk Grove. And he applied all of this to our current violent, racist pandemic that's going on, where we've seen several black people killed by white people or even by white police officers. Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and that's not all of them. Those were the most noticeable and egregious of all of them. Now, many of us, I have to admit, many of us who are not people of color are like the priest or the religious lay leader. We don't really want to get involved. Also, like them, we probably have a lot of reasons or at least excuses for not doing so. I'm going to list several that he mentioned and some other thoughts that I've had with this as well. Sometimes we want to plead, I didn't see him. You know, the interesting point is in verse 31 to 33 of Luke chapter 10, it points out that all three people in this story saw the man. But two of them acted like they didn't see him. Sometimes we want to say, I don't know the whole story. I need to know all the facts before I get involved. But let me ask you a question. As in the case of George Floyd in Minneapolis, are there any facts that could justify the killing of a man who was handcuffed and under arrest over an alleged counterfeit $20 bill? Are there any facts that could justify that? Romans chapter 5, verse 8 tells us that at the point when Jesus knew that we deserved death, he got involved and he laid down his life for us. He knew we deserved it, but he paid the price for us and laid his life down for us. Sometimes we're tempted to say, well, why don't we also talk about other things? I mean, other important things in the world, and we need to talk about those things too. But it is not a reason not to get involved in something that is clearly unjust. Some would say, well, we need to stick to preaching the gospel. And I need to make very clear, the gospel message of salvation through Jesus Christ's death and resurrection is crucial. But in Luke chapter 4, verse 18 to 19, quoting Isaiah 61, verses 1 through 3, Jesus said that the gospel, the good news that he came to preach, included these things: binding up the brokenhearted, proclaiming freedom for prisoners, restoring sight to the blind, setting oppressed people free, and also proclaiming the year of the Lord's favor. Jesus said the gospel was about all of those things, not just one. And everyone, when Jesus said that, thought he was great, until he said that that also applied to people they despised or they thought were unworthy. When he said that, they took him to a cliff to throw him off. They wanted to kill him. In Micah, the gospel is not just for after we die. It is also intended to impact today. In Micah chapter 6, verse 8, God said that his primary requirement for us, he's shown you, O man or woman, what is good and what the Lord desires of you. And what was it? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with our God. Mercy has been described as love that responds to human needs in unexpected and undeserved ways. Sometimes we also let what other people do that really we don't like stop us from getting involved. Have you ever thought to yourself or heard somebody else say, I don't like the way they're protesting? Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not following some agenda. But I can tell you this, that most black leaders say without question that violence and looting are not okay. But so often we get so upset with the methods of others that we completely miss the message they're trying to communicate. Again, remember this, Jesus died for us when we were doing things that he absolutely hated. Another thing that we can say is that I don't like talking about it because talking about it makes me feel uncomfortable. But we ignore the fact that most people of color don't have a choice about discussing these uncomfortable things, even with their kids, in order to prepare them for the prejudice and the racism that they will face in life. I have a choice as to whether I deal with this, but my black brothers and sisters, my Hispanic brothers and sisters, my Asian brothers and sisters don't have a choice because they face it every single day. And finally, one of the things that we often hear is, I don't want to get involved because I don't want to be political. I don't like politics. But the Bible does not speak of injustice as a political issue. It says it's a moral issue, and one that God says we must address, as in Micah 5:8. You must act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with your God. There are several other scriptures. As we said earlier, it's not unusual for many of us to feel a strong aversion to getting involved in such fraught times as these. But the problem is, avoiding getting involved still leaves us helpless and hopeless in such times. And that's precisely where the Samaritan's example offers each of us good news. You see, he shows us that you don't have to be somebody important to help someone who's hurting. He was a nobody. Nobody knew him. Nobody cared about him. but he got involved. He also tells us that you don't have to see it happen or know all the details in order to respond to someone in need. The Samaritan did not know anything about the details. He only knew that he saw a person who was badly in need of help. You also don't have to let what somebody else does that turns you off stop you from reaching out to someone. Think about it. The Samaritan had undoubtedly been hurt by people just like this man who now lay bleeding and broken. But he didn't let that stop him from reaching out and caring. We also hear the good news that we don't have to be comfortable in order to help the hurting. In fact, you probably will feel uncomfortable. The Samaritan, I'm sure, felt uncomfortable in interrupting his trip, in getting his hands and his clothes bloody and his donkey dirty. And I'm sure it wasn't comfortable taking care of this man for several days, and it probably wasn't comfortable paying for his care out of his own pocket. Another bit of good news is that you don't have to be political to come to the aid of someone who has been discriminated against. You see, the Pharisees might have considered this a political act because they believed that no self-respecting Jew should ever allow a Samaritan to touch them, this filthy, dirty, vile Samaritan. But in reality, nothing he did was political. Nothing was political. He simply reached out and touched the person. He acted justly. He showed mercy. And he walked humbly before both God and other human beings. As devastating as this wilderness of disease and injustice has been, the good news from the Good Samaritan is that we don't have to give in to the excuses we're so often tempted to make, nor do we have to helplessly sit by. We can get to know and sit with people who are different from us, people who are hurting. We can be quick to listen and slow to speak and to try to give answers. We can simply help meet people's needs as we see people in need. And we can refuse to sit quietly when others around us speak or act toward others, especially toward people who are not like us, in ways that grieve God's heart. In other words, we can really be the neighbor that Jesus longs for us to be. And that is the good news.